from memory. Our brain is a mechanism with an infinite capacity to store information. It's very likely that all our life experiences exist within us as memories. When we recall stored information, it appears as a new experience extracted and located in the memory store. Just because we don't recall it doesn't mean it doesn't exist. It always remains active and influences our experience. Experiences and events stored in memory are not boxed in and isolated from one another, but rather influence each other and remain active. This mutual influence and activity must proceed through logical channels and encodings. It is precisely this logic of mutual influences that makes one person appear different from another. From fear. Each of us has so many experiences that they should be enough to allow us to understand the universe. However, the case of someone who manages to reach such a level of understanding is exceptional. The only reason why understanding the universe is so exceptional. It is strange that the experiences lived have been self-invalidated. Invalidation always involves not trusting the validity and reality of one's own experiences, but rather believing that only those of others are valuable and authentic. The fears we feel are nothing more than the fears of others. It's easy to understand. The fear we experience is never authentic. It comes from not understanding a situation, from not trusting our ability to understand it, and this distrust is the result of an inability to value our own experience of reality as internal experience. The only reality we know is our internal experience. Something only exists for us when we are able to experience it. The existences of a physical world and an internal one merge and become one when we experience them. The physical world and the internal world can only be differentiated by their nature as trigger stimuli that unleash an internal process. The physical tree is different from the one that appears in our dreams, in that the former activated our internal processes through the activation of our sensory pathways, and the latter activated those same processes through central brain stimulation. Activation through a sensory pathway, or topical activation, is the only real difference between the physical world and the imaginary world. The internal process resulting from both types of activation is always the same, and determines and constitutes reality. When someone flies, the reality of their flight is not given by the ability to take off from the ground, but by the experience and sensation of doing so. So-and-so can dream they're flying, and so-and-so can get on a plane and fall asleep. No one will see so-and-so fly, but everyone will see that so-and-so does. The reality of so-and-so and so-and-so are contrary to that of the observers. So-and-so will feel they're flying, on the other hand, so-and-so won't, since observers only see Zutano fly as a result of the internal experience of seeing him fly, and since it is precisely that experience that is the only reality for observers' doors, it is also the only reality for so-and-so and so-and-so. In other words, the only one who actually flies is so-and-so, since his internal experience is flying. So-and-so doesn't fly, since he has no corresponding experience. The only ones who actually fly are the observers, since that is his internal experience. If someone asks what flight and reality depend on, there is only one honest answer: internal experience. Such a statement could lead one to think that if we all accepted as the only reality that which is experienced, the world would become a schizoid chaos, since agreements would cease to exist. The truth is that chaos is what we are experiencing when we accept something as real, simply because several observers consider it so. We should only accept it when this consideration is capable of being lived as our own experience, because admitting it before experiencing it only results in an inability to understand it. The crisis and ineffectiveness of almost all contemporary procedures for teaching and transmitting knowledge arise from not understanding that this knowledge cannot be transmitted by intellectual authority, but only as a real experience, accepting knowledge without experiencing it, but only because several authorities agree that it exists, has the most disastrous consequences. The acceptor becomes a mere repeater of knowledge, in fact identical to his teachers, and like them, he will transmit information by authority and agreement, because it is the only thing he has learned, otherwise he would not do it. The person who accepts knowledge based on authority is never sure of anything, and, above all, does not trust himself. If someone tells him that what he is thinking of doing is dangerous, he will give in to the suggestion even if it is not true. He will not use his experiences, since that before doing so, it will invalidate them by asking for advice. It will become an automated robot that will always be an effect and never a cause. In fact, you will never be able to understand the universe, because you will not understand yourself. From the images, an image is intangible, like an experience or a dream. Its duration is as long as its existence, and its existence only occurs in the instant it is experienced. The image is a product of brain activity, but in itself, it has no physical counterpart. An image is a representation of the universe that, however, is distant from it, insofar as it does not possess any tangible or measurable attributes within itself. It is true that it can give rise to physical changes and manifest and correlate with some movement, object or texture, but it is none of those things. It is neither abstract nor physical, it is simply real. Its reality is such that it cannot be denied. Perhaps one day we will know how many neurons are necessary to produce an image, and understand what brain pattern activations are carried out for it to appear. However, this knowledge will not be sufficient to explain its existence. When we have an image, we do not feel the cellular activation that originates it, nor do we observe the electrophysiology responsible for its appearance. We only have the reality and certainty of its existence as an image. The world we perceive as perception has the same characteristics as the image we represent to ourselves. The flower we see results from brain activation, but this is not enough to explain and understand it. Suppose we manage to build a machine with as many elements and connections as the human brain, and that also functions in the same way. The machine will have images and will be capable of forming internal representations, which will appear as a result of the gestalt activity of all the elements that constitute the automaton. They will arise as an effect of the mechanical or electrical activity of its elements, but they will be more than that activity and cannot be fully explained as a result of it, since they will possess very different characteristics. The image and the representations of the robot will have neither mass nor weight, nor will they occupy any space, even though they arise from elements that do. In the same way, our images are paraphysical, even though they result from the functioning of physical elements. How can we understand the appearance of a new property that, being so far removed from physics, arises from physical elements? No one knows. Of logic, the best way to understand is to become what you want to know. Only then does knowledge become part of your being, because it is experienced as your own. We will never be able to penetrate a mystery if we do not experience it. In the same way, we will never be able to know of the existence of the conceptual universe of the person with whom we relate if we are unable to become that person. Our laughter, our joy, or our frustration may be the same or different internal experience as so-and-so. The only way to know is to be so-and-so. If we could do this, we would realize that our peers' internal experience is different from ours, and in the same way that ours is different from moment to moment. But at the same time, we would know that there is something common and unifying in the differences. The adolescent knows this, and that is why he or she has a great tendency to live and become. Adolescent knows this, and that is why he or she has a great tendency to live and become different characters. Role-playing at this stage is nothing more than the desire to experience different realities, since only in this way is it possible to understand them. Bottom. Given the great difficulty of transforming ourselves into the subjects or objects we want to know, we choose to transform them into numbers, brands, or symbols that we can manipulate and relate to each other. This is nothing more than the foundation of logic. We believe that a logical understanding of symbolism will allow us to have a profound understanding of the objects or subjects they represent. Let's not fool ourselves, we're just playing. The proof of this is that our logical reasoning accepts, without any hesitation, relations of absolute identity, when in reality they are absurd and false. Relations of identity never exist as realities in our internal experience. They only exist as such when symbols are exchanged absolutely, as a result of the false thinking that considers it possible to establish rules of identity. This is why logic that handles identities is aberrant. Absolute identity between two things does not exist either in our internal experience or in the physical universe. Even the chemical structure of two apparently identical compounds is different simply because they occupy different spatial locations. Mathematics, as a logical structure, exists in itself, but it never represents reality since, like logic, it is based on identity relations. The person who uses logical procedures to arrive at knowledge deceives himself, since all he achieves is logical handling, not a real experience of the subject of knowledge. Just as absolute identity only exists and is handled in logical treatment, absolute differences are nothing more than a structure that is considered real because no one has taught otherwise. It seems contradictory to maintain that absolute identity, absolute, has as much non-existence as absolute difference. However, it is not. It is as false to say that so-and-so's joy is identical to so-and-so's as to say they are different. They simply exist in themselves, and therefore do not require or are validated through comparison. Good and bad, black and white, do not exist as differences. Moreover, they do not even exist as authentic experiences, for the simple reason that they implicitly carry the need for the opposite to be real. An experience is neither white nor good, it simply is, and as such has a unique and instantaneous separate existence. This leads us to the consideration that the only thing that exists is while it exists. The feeling of serenity that someone may experience at this moment only exists in the now and in the instant in which it is felt. To think that it was felt yesterday or that it will be felt tomorrow without feeling it is to rely on the logical structure that considers time as real. It is to forget that even thinking about tomorrow or yesterday only occurs in the now, and that the sensation that is not felt does not exist. To think that one is not happy in the present and to wish to be happy in the future constitutes the most absolute aberration. It means that one denies the present experience and makes it falsely dependent on a situation that does not exist. If one will be happy in the future, it will only happen at that moment, but it is not happening now, and that is the only important thing. Reasoning logically about a future event, trying to understand it through reasoning, is merely a substitute for our inability to live in the present. It is trying to understand what it will feel like without experiencing it. It is structuring and defining a path, forgetting that doing so destroys all possibility of learning. When we logically analyze an event of probable occurrence, and therefore we anticipate the internal event that will trigger such an event, we invalidate ourselves. Only by understanding that reality is an internal construction, and that this exists only at the moment in which it occurs, we will be able to learn and live. of the judgments. To judge someone is to underestimate them, to think that what determines their behavior and their reality is simple and mediocre. When we say that someone is making a mistake, or when we consider someone stupid, simple, bad, or any other category quantum and unitary, all we do is demonstrate our inability to penetrate the experience of someone we judge. If we could do it, we would realize that things are neither simple nor easy, that the reasons of the other are as much or more complex than ours, and above all, that they are determined for a whole history and a series of reference points. Judging is very easy and convenient, and it always has a narcissistic and self-indulgent component. What we do when we judge is turn ourselves into an absolute and unfailing point of reference. At least that's what we think, and we feel decisive and determinants of realities. The truth is that when we judge, we are nothing more than a blade of grass moved by the wind. The problem is that at that moment, that blade of grass thinks it's an oak tree and acts like one. To judge someone is to consider oneself incapable of making mistakes, and it always arises from ignorance and a lack of knowledge of ourselves. The magnitude of our blindness is such that instead of discarding judgments and realizing that they are just a game, we institutionalize them by creating a science of psychological diagnosis. In it, people are considered healthy or sick, depending on their greater or lesser acceptance of structures and agreements, when in reality the only sick person is the diagnostician, considering himself as the decider of realities. The only health or illness is given by the greater or lesser respect that a person gives to his internal reality. The only illness is the distrust and invalidation of ourselves. Of the man of science. Science can be teaching and learning only when it provides information that cannot be obtained through internal analysis. The certainty of knowledge obtained through self-analysis is sufficient to obviate the need for experimental replication. When scientists go to the laboratory, despite their certainty, they are driven only by the apparent desire to share and transmit that certainty. However, this is a deception, for the simple reason that it will not be possible to achieve certainty in others through the objective communication of information. When scientists dedicate themselves to trying to prove to other observers what is obvious to them, science ceases to teach them and becomes just another game. This doesn't mean that scientific knowledge is invalid, it only means that it is not sufficient in itself, and loses all meaning when it becomes an activity of replicating knowledge. The scientist should be happy because the information he obtains through his work is, above all, knowledge about himself. If he is unhappy, it means that his work is nothing more than a deception and a prostitution of himself. The scientist should be free from all structure. When, on the other hand, he is rigid and enslaved, it only means that science is not a result of himself, but, on the contrary, he has become a result and effect of science, of certainty. There are those who think that their certainty regarding the explanation and knowledge of a phenomenon is deeper, clearer, and more mature than the certainty of another. This idea gives rise to the emergence of imposing statements regarding reality. In other words, the person who believes their certainty is the only valid one feels entitled to force another to accept it, without considering that the other may have a different reality and internal experience. While it is true that knowledge is not the data handled, but rather the experiential certainty, it is also true that the latter may not be shareable. The reason for this is not that certainty is relativistic, but only that it is the existence of different certainties. We all arrive at the same inner knowledge because its truth is not relative, but there are different gradients and rhythms to achieve it. Some people go very slowly, others walk more quickly. Transmitting a certainty from an advanced level to a delayed one makes no sense or possibility. Doing so despite the above has three consequences: confusion, hostility, and misunderstanding. It is necessary to wait for the other to reach the same level than one, because at that moment the certainty will be of both. When someone tries to force the acceptance of certainties, they show that they have not understood or realized that there are different gradients and different speeds to get there, and furthermore that their certainty is false. When someone feels upset in a disagreement, they show that they have forgotten that it arises from a difference in levels, and not because of the existence of different truths. Truth is unique. To think otherwise is to give too much importance to the apparent existence of differences between entities. Every human being is surrounded by a multitude of structures formed during the process of socialization. Differences depend on the number of existing structures and how many of them have already been discarded, never on the existence of a basic difference. Of doubts. It's absolutely impossible to doubt yourself when you're yourself. You only doubt yourself when you're the effect of external considerations. When the knowledge someone transmits is automatically absorbed and handled, the recipient can easily doubt its value, reliability, or certainty. When, on the other hand, knowledge comes from within and is the result of an internal experience, there is never any doubt about its reality. However, internal experience is not enough to stop doubting. It is essential that it not be self-invalidated. Self-invalidation is the introjection of others' doubts. It is the acceptance of them as real and the forgetting of their origin. If we could at least remember that the doubts expressed by the other are also the result of the introjection that this other has made of the doubts of another other, and this one in turn of those of another other, and this one of those of another other, etc. We would never doubt of knowing. Some people think that theoretical knowledge is different from knowledge obtained through physical handling of an object. In truth, there may or may not be a difference between the two. The difference is not in the knowledge itself, but in the person who knows it. It is possible that through direct handling of a physical object, it is possible to gain a better understanding of its characteristics. But it is also possible that such handling teaches absolutely nothing, and instead abstraction about the same object. Yes, when a learner relies on the considerations and opinions of those around them rather than their own, real knowledge is no longer possible. However, when the learner chooses to learn, knowledge begins to become reality. In the latter case, the approach can be theoretical, experimental, or any other type, and it doesn't necessarily mean that you'll learn more or less, or that there will be any difference. It all depends on the approach and the learner's motivation, not on what is being learned, of the levels. The same event, especially when it relates to internal experiences, can be explained on many levels. For example, the feeling of anxiety. Someone might say that their anxiety is due to feeling judged by everyone. While this may be true, it is only a very superficial level of explanation, since the feeling of judgment only comes from considering what one does or feels inappropriate or bad. But this, in turn, represents only a second level of explanation, because feeling that what one does is inappropriate or bad results, in turn, from feeling insecure. Furthermore, feeling insecure stems from the idea that one's own feelings are worthless. This invalidation, in turn, results from considering internal reality less important than external reality. This, in turn, depends on the establishment in the past of an agreement, and the structure that emerges from it. Thus, anxiety arises from the fear of discarding structure and agreement. This fear stems from the idea that discarding structure will lead to a situation of internal emptiness. The perspective of internal emptiness in turn stems from the idea that the interior does not exist. If we were to do the same type of analysis on many of our negative internal states, such as those related to feelings of fear, dependence, loss of control, frustration, etc., we would realize that they are all based ultimately on the idea that the internal does not exist or is unimportant. Since the feeling of non-existence arises from a whole history, It could be said that every negative internal state contains within itself a person's entire history. Perhaps this is why discarding one's entire personal history has the consequence of the disappearance of all unpleasant experiences, of feeling and dependence. There are two kinds of people, those who feel and those who play at feeling. Those who feel are capable of surrendering themselves without thinking that doing so might imply any kind of dependency. On the other hand, those who play at feeling cannot surrender to anything because it makes them think of dependency and a lack of freedom. To understand the absurdity, it's enough to analyze for a moment the fact that people who feel have learned to be free and independent in order to feel it, while those who play only depend on the structure of the game. Those who feel are not afraid of depending. Because he is free, on the other hand, the player is terrified by the prospect of dependence, since he is in fact dependent on his games. Those capable of surrender have learned that doing so doesn't mean losing a part of themselves, but rather, it means getting closer to their essence. Those who are unable to do so are those who have learned to care about remaining intact, like a gift-wrapped puzzle that, once one piece is lost, ceases to function. We're not a collection of parts, nor are we wrapped in tissue paper. We're unique, unified entities that don't rust or lose parts upon delivery. Surrender means considering the act of loving without schedules, restrictions, or structures as the most important thing. It means considering it an act of creation that cannot be substituted or compared to any other, of communication. How can someone understand what love, anguish, fear, or ecstasy is if they've never experienced it? Is impossible. This means that you can't convey an internal experience to someone who hasn't lived through it. Achieving a transmission of internal experiences is nothing more than reconfirming or reconstructing them in the person who receives them. Communication between two people depends on the degree of reconstruction possible. Communication is complete when the coincidence of internal experiences is greatest. Communication is null when one person's experiences don't match the other's. Communication ends when in some way what one of the two people communicating reveals isn't understood by the other. In other words, when the capacity for cognition is blocked or non-existent, of certainty and change. Real change is only possible when one is able to achieve a state of certainty. Self-knowledge is a game when it's based on data. Only when certainty appears does self-knowledge become real. Data can be transmitted. Certainty as such cannot be transmitted. This is explained by the fact that the only certainty possible is that which results from internal experience, and this cannot be directly transferred from one person to another. There's a dichotomy between data and certainty. When someone isn't sure, has no certainty, they need data. It follows that when someone has certainty, they no longer need it. All types of psychological therapies should strive to achieve certainty, not data, in the patient. In fact, they all try to convey internal experiences and therefore certainties. But since this cannot be achieved directly, they simply attempt to create the conditions in which these certainties emerge. The therapist must be free from all theory in order to achieve the conditions in which certainties are communicated. When the therapist relies on a theory rather than on his or her own certainty, he or she demonstrates that the latter doesn't exist in itself, and therefore there's no way he or she can achieve it in the patient. This is because if someone doesn't know something, they can't provoke it in another. The need to conform to a theory is the need for data knowledge, and having such a need only means that the level of certainty has not been reached. From all of the above, we are convinced that real knowledge is made up of certainties, not data. Similarly, real change in a person only results from another change in their internal reality. This change can only be achieved when the level of certainty is reached, of the interactions. The emergence of new knowledge is a direct result of the ability to establish interactions. When someone studies a particular event and is unable to identify its interactions and relationships with others, their level of knowledge is superficial and redundant. Only when knowledge of an event is part of a mosaic of interactions does the event become known. The ability to establish and understand a body of interactions is what is commonly called integrative capacity. The person who is able to integrate scattered information is the one who truly understands it. When information is integrated, new knowledge emerges, since integration results in the emergence of new laws of interaction. These cannot be discerned through knowledge of an isolated event, since they are not included in that knowledge. It is only in relating that the laws of relationships arise. Since these were not there before, their appearance is also that of a new knowledge, of expectation. The expectation of an existence has as its only existence the same expectation of teaching and learning. When two people establish a relationship, and one of them feels they can teach the other something, they will never succeed if they see themselves doing it in the process. You only teach when teaching becomes irrelevant. When you are yourself, without limits, without censorship, without self-indulgence. You learn from what you see. If you observe that someone has a motive to teach you, you will learn to recognize that motive and to act in correspondence and consonance with it, nothing more. If, on the other hand, you observe someone being, without motives or plans, you will learn everything that exists behind plans and motives. That is, you will learn from being. Your learning will come to you and teach you. You will not go to the learning or the teaching. Because someone who is everything. That is what will be taught, and that is what will be learned. Meeting a person who doesn't try to teach is the most wonderful experience there is. That's when you really learn. Of serenity. I know someone who only lives in one world. Anything that happens in that world affects him and makes him doubt himself. If someone in that world has a problem, everything becomes a problem, even himself. If an accident happens, everything becomes an accident, even himself. If someone is in pain, everything becomes pain, even himself. I wish you to leave that world and discover many others. Only then will you stop becoming a problem, an accident, or a pain. Only then will you know that there are more realities. Only then will you stop fearing. That person is imprisoned. His imprisonment is for the sake of it. He will cease to be a prisoner when he leaves that world. In his confinement, he only knows the four walls of his prison. He himself is the four walls. When he knows other worlds, the barriers will fall. He will understand that they can disappear at will. He will know that he is far more valuable than any limits. At that moment you will begin to understand, and when you do, you will achieve serenity. You will know that being affected by a problem in one world results from not knowing about others. You will stop thinking you know everything there is. You will stop feeling so important, and that will set you free. Of the thresholds, there are people who have great difficulty feeling emotions, experiencing things, learning about themselves, or giving themselves away. There are others who have a great capacity to love without censorship or inhibitions, to give themselves or to feel. We say that the former have a very high reaction threshold, and that the latter have a relatively low one. People with a high threshold constantly monitor themselves. Those with a low threshold don't require any monitoring, they simply trust in themselves. The magnitude of the controls and thresholds is given and depends on the degree of socialization. If one has learned to adjust and adapt, that is, if the level of socialization is high, so will inhibition and control, and therefore the reaction threshold. If, on the other hand, the level of adjustment is low, the threshold will also be low. This means that people incapable of feeling are those who give maximum importance to control, and that sensitive people, on the other hand, consider it unnecessary and absurd. The connection between the degree of socialization and the reaction threshold is clear to understand if one is able to understand the meaning and characteristics of socialization. When we talk about it, we're referring to the process by which a subject is taught to adapt and adjust to the desires and needs of the people around them. This adjustment directly results in the introjection of others, and this in turn creates, within oneself, a system of self-censorship and self-judgment. Self-censorship and self-judgment are a blockage that inhibits everything it touches. It is this inhibition that alters thresholds. The alteration always increases them, thus decreasing sensitivity of living and understanding. The entire beginning of our story is pure experience. The child lives without questioning or analyzing the consequences or causes of his experiences. If you ask him why he lives, he answers that he lives for life. Only when he grows up does he begin to analyze. If analysis it is pure and without prejudice, it can come to understand what it previously experienced. An adult who has grown up undergoes a similar process. First, they live and then understand their experience, which means that understanding has no limits, since neither does the number of experiences. If, on the other hand, the adult has grown up as a spectator of themselves, they will tend to try to understand before experiencing. If this is the case, both their experiences and their learning will have limits. Of emerging properties, internal experience is always an emergent property. This is because a pain, an emotion, the image of a flower, or even the perceptual vision of the same, are not contained, nor are they explainable per se in the activity of a group of neurons. When pain occurs, there is neuronal activity concomitant with the sensation. However, neuronal activity itself does not contain the pain. Similarly, the physical presentation of an illuminated object results in the appearance of an image of it. The image arises as a result of the activation of a neuronal population, specifically the cells that make up the visual system. However, the image is not contained in the activation of neurons either. There is a missing link between neuronal activation and internal experience. The only way to understand this link is to assume that the activation of a set or cluster of elements results in the emergence of a property that does not exist and is not predictable based on their unitary activation. The emergent property is the result of the interactions of the elements. This implies a Gestalt process, in which the laws of the cluster emerge as a result of organization. Since interactions have neither mass nor weight nor atomic or molecular makeup, what results from them possesses those characteristics. To put it another way, the internal image of an object, the sensation of pain or emotion, are not physical. This doesn't mean that correlations with physical changes can't be found. It simply means that they are not physical in and of themselves. The existence of a correlation is often confused with the essence of a phenomenon. When we experience a visual image, it is possible to record electroencephalographic or other changes during its occurrence. The electroencephalographic change is physical, but it is not the image, it merely correlates with it. The image itself has no physical character. It is in itself different of the correlations that may be found with other phenomena. All of the above indicates that the internal experience is a property that emerges as a result of the interactions between the elements that form part of a complex organization. This emergent property, being a new result of an organization of interactions, does not have a physical character, even though it arises from a set of physical elements. The problem of interaction is as real as the elements from which it arises, however. The result of this interaction is always something distinct from the interacting elements or units. Perhaps all our internal experiences are that new product resulting from an interaction, or even the interaction itself. The same situation occurs in a relationship between two people. A relationship, when not based on structure or agreement, is an act of creation, and it produces something that is not self-contained within each of the participants. The highest degree of relationship occurs when, as a result of interaction, love is created. Gorostiza's phrase, "with him, with me, with the three of us," represents the poetic vision of the above. Whether we think we experience time simply because we see movement, we perceive the movement we observe as continuous and in one direction. It's the illusion of continuity that deceives us. Our sensory systems are characterized by filling discontinuous spaces. The movement of an object is always made up of quantum steps, each of which is, in itself, independent of the one that follows and precedes it. If our perceptual equipment were constructed in such a way that it allowed us to see quantum steps, we would have no need to resort to the concept of time. We would realize that each quantum instant is unique and independent, and that its existence is only when it is, and therefore timeless. In the case of our muscular movements, the situation is even more obvious. The movement of a hand or arm is only an appearance of continuity. In reality, it is formed by a sum of elementary muscular contractions, each of which is in turn regulated by discrete impulses. In the same waveform, our sensations are quantum. Each moment is unique, and only exists while we live it. The idea of the past or future also exists while one is living it. If I remember what I did without actually doing it, the memory exists only in this moment. If I think about what will happen, the thought occurs now, and that is its only existence. Time, therefore, is just another structure. It does not exist in itself, but only as an appearance associated with the illusion of movement, of waiting. People who are desperately searching are the ones most likely to fall into dependency. All they need to do is find someone who has found the path, and they'll want to learn what they have to teach them. They believe that this teaching is so valuable that nothing can equal it. They are capable of giving everything and never hesitate to give themselves, and all of it, to find what they so intensely seek. They begin to expect the one who knows to teach them, and they desire the almost sacred feeling they experience to be mutual. If one of the two has understood that all waiting is absurd since the paths are unique and individual, they will try to show this to the other. If the other is intelligent enough, they will understand instantly. If they are not, they will fall into despair until they finally realize that they are not there. To understand that the solution is only found within oneself, of the road. We are certain that there are paths that, when followed, will lead us to being. We think this way because it is what we have been taught, never by our own discovery. We tumble and zigzag, we walk along a path and we twist and turn, always hoping to find it. It's the hardest and most difficult part, since we don't know what we'll find. Sometimes we think we are close and sometimes we almost touch it. It's only when we discover that the path doesn't exist, that it's a fantasy, that we stop searching and begin to be. At that moment, we begin to learn, of letting out. When we act with the idea of how we should act, and the action is determined by a structure, everything becomes the structure and the should be. When the structure is understanding, and you start trying to know things before living them, all you live is the structure of knowing and understanding. The only way to learn about yourself is to first live, and later, understand the experience. It's so obvious. Like the thought that before something can be understood, it must be born. If that something hasn't been born, and therefore doesn't exist, there's no way to understand it. Wanting to understand something that hasn't been born is simply understanding the understanding. When someone lives without thinking about how they do it, they let out what's inside them. It's only when this letting out happens that what they are appears. It's in those moments that how they act, what they say, and what provokes grace or anger teaches us free and truly what exists inside. If someone wants to know themselves, they must first learn to let out, without restrictions, what they have inside. Without restrictions means not trying to understand it at the moment they are experiencing it. When, after having lived it, the experience is analyzed, it is understood. If, on the other hand, one tries to understand an experience that is not has been had, it only makes a falsehood. To be able to understand an experience that has been had, it is not enough to wish to do so. The analysis must be free, and without prejudice, that is, without any pre-established logical structure or pattern. The reason for the latter is because understanding is also an experience of freedom. We are accustomed to hearing that freedom is the ideal, that only by achieving it can we be happy. Almost always, the freedom referred to is related to breaking a restriction or physical impediment. Achieving the state of freedom in these terms implies a state of uninhibited movement. The truth is that the true state of freedom is, above all, internal. Freedom, as the absence of external or physical restriction or inhibition, is a very primitive concept. The profound meaning of the idea of freedom implies an experience of withdrawal and the rejection of all authority. Being free means trusting that what one feels, thinks, or acts is of the utmost value. It implies the recognition that nothing but oneself can define what is right or wrong, desirable or detestable, good or evil. When this state is achieved, one no longer accepts submission to, or the exercise of any authority, since one recognizes the meaninglessness and falsity of such authority. Being free implies being able to act and feel without restrictions, without decision-making structures, without subjugation or ideals, goals or moral or religious considerations. The purpose of being free is to be able to learn from our surroundings and from ourselves. Only a free person comes to know themselves, because they let their true essence and their real self emerge. In doing so, they can understand their reality because they let it emerge and allow it to manifest. The lack of inner freedom results in the impossibility of learning from the dream. At the beginning of ontogenetic development, humans spend most of their time sleeping. The characteristics of sleep in a newborn are identical to those found in an adult, at least in terms of activity. Electroencephalographic and electromyographic behavioral sleep. This is not the silent sleep known as slow sleep, but rather the other type, which is accompanied, in adults, by internal images and experiences. We do not know whether the newborn experiences internal images and experiences during sleep, like those of an adult. All we know is that the activity we can detect is identical. As humans grow, they begin to spend part of their time in the waking state, and the time spent in dream imagery decreases concomitantly. It would therefore seem that waking arises from sleep and is a particular case of it. Perhaps for this reason, the dreams we dream never lose their connection with their byproduct, that is, with waking. Perhaps the relationship between the two states is not random, but complementary and necessary. We develop in a society that demands and reinforces control and inhibition. Our waking thought processes are always subordinated to the structure that gives utmost importance to the preservation of stable situations and security, and fears any situation of internal and external freedom. We are taught to interact with the people around us through the acceptance and internalization of rules of interaction that were invented to avoid friction. Furthermore, the training we undergo implies the consideration that it is important not to express what we think or feel when these sensations or thoughts oppose the rules and agreements of socialization. since we continue to experience them despite not expressing them. A situation of conflict and contradiction is created between two experiential spheres, the external and the internal one. Dreams may serve the function of reducing conflict by releasing inhibitions and controlling others. During sleep, we are free. It is the freedom we have been taught to discard during waking life. In dreams, we know ourselves, because during their occurrence, what we truly are emerges, of opposites and experiences. According to Lao Tzu, everyone takes beauty for beauty, and that's why they know what is ugly. Everyone takes good for good, and that's why they know what is evil. It cannot be any other way. Only when one has lived a reality can one know. If I have known love, I can know when it has disappeared and turned into hate. If I have lived goodness, I can know when it ceases to exist and appears evil. If, on the other hand, I have not experienced an emotion, I will be unable to detect its presence, absence, or opposite, either in myself or in others. Knowledge is certainty, and this only appears when something has been experienced. If I doubt, it means I don't know. If I am able to see what exists and know when it has ceased to exist, it means I know it because I have experienced it. If I ask questions and doubt myself, it means I haven't lived long enough, of understanding and changing. Just as there is only one kind of knowledge, that which is based on certainties and not on data, in the same way there is only one way of understanding, that which makes us change. When someone tells us what they have learned, and we simply listen, and although it seems logical and intellectually reasonable to us, it does not make us change. It means that we have not understood it. What is the point of hearing and seeing if what we see and hear remains just seeing and hearing? What's the point of finding the logic of a reasoning if all you achieve is finding the logic? What is the point of knowing data if it is not transformed into experiences? We can tell someone they shouldn't be afraid. If, despite agreeing with us, they continue to be afraid, all we've achieved by speaking is to move the molecules in the air. Does this mean that words are just words and cannot be transformed into action and change? Some people think so. For my part, I think that words are tools, and their ability to bring about real change doesn't depend on the word itself, but on the recipient. Someone can change by hearing. Another can only do so by falling out of a plane, but change doesn't depend on hearing or falling, but on the sensitivity of the person hearing or the person falling. Of the knowledge that is known. There is a level of knowledge superior to any other. It is the wisdom of knowing itself, the knowledge that is known. When someone achieves this, they reach the level of certainty, stop doubting, and begin to be free. This degree of knowledge does not apply or refer to specific events, but rather relates to general aspects. It is the certainty that the essence exists equally in everyone, or it is the knowledge that the world is constructed in each person, or it is the confidence in the existence of internal experiences, or it's the certainty that many behaviors still depend on personal history. Knowing that you know is not a degree of clarity that impedes knowledge, but rather a state of openness and disinhibition that facilitates it. It is, simply, a level of self-respect and self-confidence, of the authority. Yesterday I had a dream. It was a room in a house. It was filled with chairs, and on the wall hung the most beautiful painting I'd ever seen. It was a gigantic oil painting depicting 6 men. Each had a different expression, but all reflected depth and serenity. People entered the room. Each one stopped in front of the painting, knelt and kissed the ground. Then they went to the place where the chairs were and sat down in one of them. The same scene was repeated until all the chairs were occupied. We all looked at the painting. The oil painting began to come to life. The painted figures moved, and the one in the center began to speak. I don't remember what it said, but it was sensible, reasonable, and profound. We were all amazed. We thought the organization that included the house, the painting, and the chairs was powerful and wise, capable of bringing an oil painting to life. I stood up from my chair and approached the painting. On one side of the frame was a door. I opened it and entered a small room where a film projector was propped up behind the painting. I realized it was all a fake. Between the projector and the painting was some kind of optical filter. I picked it up and removed it. Then I went out to the room with the chairs and looked at the painting. The figures were still moving and talking, but the light was so bright that the illusion of reality. The members of the organization started yelling at me, as did the people in the chairs. They told me to put the filter back in place, or else I'd suffer the consequences. Everyone looked very unhappy and disgruntled. I took the filter and put it back in place. The figures in the painting seemed real again. I turned around. I saw the people in the chairs. They were happy. I saw the people from the organization. They were satisfied. From external events. All information is contained in the objects and events around us, but knowledge resides within us. A drop of water, a flower, or a mountain are almost infinite in their potential to provide us with information. Whether we learn from them depends on our ability to view them without limitations, prejudices, or preconceived ideas. A river can teach us, like Siddhartha, that everything remains the same but also changes, that everything returns to its place of origin, or that everything is contained within itself. What we can learn from the river is not in the river itself, it is only within us, themselves. If we were able to understand it perfectly, every minute of our lives would be absolute plenitude, total happiness, that is, freedom. From the Bible. According to the Bible, man lost paradise the moment he acquired knowledge. This idea, although seemingly absurd, has great depth. Childhood for humans is a paradise in the happiest sense of the term. The infant learns and experiences the world without thinking that he himself is learning from it or getting to know it. What he does and feels is in and of itself, without self-censorship, self-inhibition, or self-assessment. In other words, at this stage, there is no difference between the observed and the observer, because there is no self-expectation. The child is one with the world around him, because a mechanism that allows the duality of inner self versus outer self has not developed within him. In the adult, on the contrary, the phenomenon of being a spectator of oneself has developed to such a degree that it rarely stops functioning. The adult claims to have knowledge of the world by feeling capable of evaluating it, when in reality the only thing he has developed is the harmful habit of observing himself and adjusting to logical intellectual structures. In this situation, the only thing he achieves is the separation between himself and the world around him, that is, the loss of innocence, and the ability to create and live freely. If the kind of knowledge the Bible refers to is that which relates to seeing oneself knowing, then the Bible is right, paradise has been lost, of drugs. The growing trend toward drug use in our time has a reason. Our mechanized, homogenized, standardized, technified, and objectified culture teaches its members to consider the pragmatic and the communicable as the highest value. It emphasizes that man requires structure and agreement to be happy, and forgets that the only happiness is development, respect, and trust in internal reality. The man of our time is a spectator of himself. This self-exposure is based on how the outside world, people, perceive and evaluate him. Our civilizations and culture teach us to distrust our internal processes, considering them subjective and worthless, and to rely on agreement and observation, external structured as the only worthy one. The teachings that make us spectators of ourselves are based on the idea that the only reality is that which manifests itself and provokes agreement among several observers. One sees oneself doing things, feeling or thinking, as if one were one of the observers. which prevents doing, feeling, or thinking. It's not about the feeling of stepping outside of oneself and objectively and clearly recognizing the structures and prejudices one has fallen into. We're not referring to this when we talk about being a spectator of oneself. It's more about the academic situation of self-worth conditioned by structures is what we are referring to. It is the sacrifice of pure internal experience for the sake of logic, structure, and valuation that is objected to. Man needs to live without thinking or valuing living. He needs to be able to see the world in a pure form, that is, without thinking about whether he is seeing it, and whether this vision conforms or not to morality, religion, the state, or any other structure. Since our society inhibits and censors pure experience, and the overwhelming need for it persists, a conflict arises that, in many cases, attempts are made to resolve through drug use. Drug use is not, at its root, driven by a desire to escape reality. Rather, it is the need to experience it without being a spectator of the experience of living it, of death. According to Krishnamurti, it is necessary to die in life in order to be free. This seemingly necrophilic thought has great depth. Throughout our development, we have been bombarded by thousands of imposing considerations. We have been taught that there are good things and bad things, that the only way to be free is through death. Being consists of achieving positions of power, whether economic, political, or intellectual. We have learned to fear and hate, to be jealous and envious. We have been imposed with the idea that our value and essence are determined by how others perceive and evaluate us. We've been taught to be insecure, and therefore to become depressed, anxious, and disrespectful. We've learned that love involves possession and use, and so on. This entire series of lessons and learnings constitutes our history. The only way to free ourselves from them all is to let that past die. Only that death in life will set us free of language. We talk about a forest as a single entity reducible to a category, when in reality it is an infinite set of different units that are in themselves independent of one another. We refer to Fulanito as Juan, Pedro, Ignacio, Rodolfo, etc., as if it were possible to reduce his humanity to a name, and as if this, like the name, were stable, fixed, and immutable. It would seem that communication requires such reductionism to be possible. An expert in human communication would consider his activity chaotic if he didn't use discrete semantic categories, encompassing hundreds of entities. How, he might ask, would it be possible to communicate if we lacked stable reductionist designations? If, in order to talk about Zutano, we had to give all of his characteristics as they exist at the moment we do so, we would fall, he would tell us, into the most monstrous absurdity, since it would take us years to convey any idea. Such an expert could be asked what the point is of communication based on fixed and reductionist categories, when we know in advance that it is unrealistic because it is biased and static. It's true that uncategorized communication would be slower, but perhaps that would teach us to communicate only what is authentic, that is, what doesn't require the opposite to be understood. Our language is riddled with terms that reduce to a linguistic unity what is in reality irreducible. The habit of using them would be serious enough simply for having an aberrant effect on our communication. But their true terrifying nature lies in the fact that they alter and distort our perception of the world. They cause it to be perceived as made up of simple, static, and therefore redundant conglomerates. When this redundant nature is transferred from the objects that surround us to our experiences, the situation becomes dramatic. We begin to see ourselves as a set of categories that are not only identified by a term, but are also considered explained and known simply by verbalizing the linguistic unit name we use to name them. Since names are unitary and stable, so too do the experiences, feelings, emotions, or objects they name. Thus, we can experience our depression, our anguish, or our love as unitary and static quantum categories, forgetting that they are only such in our language and never in themselves. When we teach a child to speak, we are not only giving him a superficial means of communication, but, above all, we are transmitting to him an entire experiential philosophy in which we include all our reductionist categorizations. The child taught in this way faces the horrible dilemma of sacrificing all his perceptual, experiential, and phenomenological richness by using the language we impose on him, or preserving this richness, even if he is considered an abnormal and pathological case for refusing to communicate what is in reality incommunicable. This does not mean that language is inherently aberrant, rather, it is the use to which it is put that gives it that character. If we were able to truly separate linguistic unity from what it seeks to represent, and if we did not reduce to simple categories that which is not reducible, our language would have the real quality for which it was invented and developed, from the reality of dreams. In the same way that the color of an object is not contained in the wavelength of the light it reflects, but rather in the internal experience created from this wavelength, so all the qualities of physical objects such as texture, smell, form, etc., result from the experiential transformation that occurs within us and not in the object itself. This means that the reality of the world as we perceive it is a product of our internal construction, and, as such, is no different from the internal construction associated with extra-vigilant states, such as those that occur during dreams. The reality of dreams differs from waking reality only in one respect. During sleep, we are absolutely causal. During waking life, we can cease to be so. When we dream, we create the universe in such a complete and real way that we not only construct what we do in waking state, that is, the qualities of objects, but we also construct the objects themselves. The construction of reality is more complete in sleep than during waking state. That is the only difference between the two states. In fact, all other differences generally attributed to the two states result from structures, agreements, and preconceived ideas. Prophets, visionaries, and those who claim to have astral travel differ from ordinary people in that they respect their dreams more and therefore do not consider them unrealistic. They are not strange and unattainable people. They have simply understood that there is only one reality, that which is constructed and results from our internal processes of self-knowledge through observation. Fulanito is complacent, but he doesn't realize it. Sutanito lives in his past, but he doesn't know it. Perenganito only feels satisfied if he manages to obtain the approval of others, but he has never reflected on it. None of the three know or understand each other, for the simple reason that they are incapable of seeing themselves from a point of view other than the one they have always used. Furthermore, they consider that another point of view cannot exist since they have never known one other than the one they use. If they have ever had a relationship with someone different from themselves, they have not noticed the difference because they have seen the other from the only point of reference they know and, therefore, have included in their observation what coincides with it and discarded what does not. These people have never loved. They have probably possessed and used others, but they certainly do not know what love is. Love is self-knowledge. A loving relationship is one in which the participants come to know themselves through their knowledge of each other. For this to occur, this knowledge must be based on and arise from free observation, that is, from the absence of prejudice and preconception. Love is not an exchange of reinforcement or pleasure, nor is it an agreement or commitment, much less the satisfaction of needs. Rather, it is self-knowledge based on free observation. If Fulanito, Zutanito, and Perenganito loved, they would know that one point of reference is not more important or valuable than another. They are simply different. If they knew love, they would know themselves, since they would recognize in themselves points of reference, structures and agreements that do not exist or that are different in those whom they observe and love. Of redundancy. Redundant knowledge is knowledge that loops back on itself in a circle whose beginning connects to its end. Each of us has been trained to perceive and feel the world in a very particular and specific way. Our relationships with others generally rely on those rigid frames of reference. In turn, frames of reference are based on prior learning that determines the characteristics of a human relationship or any other activity. Since everything is predetermined, nothing new occurs, and if it does, it is discarded because it doesn't fit the frames of reference conditioned by our history. It is necessary to understand this well. When experience is based on thought, nothing other than that thought can occur. If thought is based on structures, only structures will exist. Everything that happens will be seen through the lens of thought, structure, and therefore nothing new will happen, and everything will be redundant. If we operate according to theoretical models, all we do is adjust to those models or adjust any external contingency to make it approximate what we want it to be. In this circumstance, it's our past and our history that are present, never what surrounds us. We are a prison of models, thoughts, and preconceived ideas, and prison is the only thing that exists for us. It's only when we stop thinking about how things should be that redundancy ends and we begin to learn of imagination and memory. All imaginative processes are the result of the activation of our memory stores. If someone closes their eyes and sees the image of a mountain, it means it was stored in their brain cells. Sometimes, images thus evoked are amazingly complete and detailed, as much or more than those originated during a perceptual process. This extraordinary capacity indicates that our memory stores information just as it enters the brain through our sensory channels. Our handling of such stored information is rarely as comprehensive as one might expect if the information contained in the images were taken into account. If someone were to ask us for a verbal description or simply a drawing of any of our internal images, it would be exceptional if they contained the same, or at least approximate information as the image. There must be some process that transforms memory information and gives rise to different memories. In the transition from storage to recall, there is a loss of detail, precision, and the completeness of the information. I can conjure up the image of a bicycle, with all the detail and content of a real one. The image shows the exact number of links that make up the steel chain, the number and length of the spokes on the wheels, and so on. This means that all that information is stored in me. However, if someone were to ask me about the number of links or rays, I would not be able to answer. That means that verbal evocation is not a direct copy of the stored information, but an incomplete transformation of it. The reason for this is probably that verbal recall works in terms of reductionist categories, whereas stored information is not categorized in itself, but is found just as it is perceived, that is, with all the elements that make up any object. Categorization comes later, as management of information that in itself does not belong to any category. If the categorization of information were contained in the original storage, there would be no possibility of subsequent rearrangement or creative manipulation, other than that of the primary categorization. Since the stored information can be recategorized as many times as desired, the original storage is not categorized. The difference between the evocation of a visual image and its verbalization, in addition to being done in terms of categories, is determined according to the freedom of the process. Verbalization is subject to strict rules, but images are not. Rules are responsible for the loss of information in verbalization. The lack of them is the cause of an image's extraordinary informative content. Of the decisions Since the experience of what happens in my body is constructed in my brain, it can change that construction. If the experience is pain, for example, in a leg, the pain is not located in the leg, but rather inside the body of the brain. This is where pain is constructed. The signals that originate this construction may well come from the leg, but the experience is always the result of central activation. While the brain can construct pain, it is also capable of modifying or nullifying it. Whether it does so or not depends on its decision. For change to occur, the decision must be absolute, that is, without doubt. The brain itself must be certain that he is the constructor so that he can also be the modifier of time and thought. It's not that thought doesn't last at all, it's that time doesn't exist. Or at least it doesn't exist as a constant. If it were a physical constant, psychological time would be too, and in reality, it isn't. I can feel like 2 days have passed when my clock has only marked a few minutes. Or, on the contrary, 2 days can pass and I will feel like it has only been 2 minutes. Who should I listen to? The mechanical clock, or my certainty of creation and knowledge? The ultimate satisfaction is the creation of a painting, a symphony, an idea, an image, a dream. And it is because the one who creates is truly one. And that activity of ours is the source of all beauty. To create means to make something out of nothing. Before even existing as an image in the painter, a painting is nothing. It is only when that image appears, or when it is transformed into an oil painting, that it is born. This act of creation is unparalleled. What one feels during its occurrence cannot be described, but it surely constitutes the most satisfying emotion anyone can experience. Every act of creation is accompanied by the same sensation, regardless of its specific nature. Thus, reasoning about the reason for a particular process is, in itself, an act of creation, and as such, identical to that of an artistic or any other kind of creation. It's the experience that counts, not its intellectualized relationship to an event or situation. Finding the relationship between two or more variables is creating the relationship, for the simple reason that it does not physically exist. This creative act is neither more valuable nor less important than any other. Knowledge is this same creative act. It is not the accumulation of data, methods, information, or any other measurable and storable fact. True knowledge is the perennial creation, since any knowledge is precisely a creative act. A man in a state of knowledge is one who has learned to create all the time, without limit, without interval. He is the originator of knowledge. From asking, only he who doesn't know asks. He who knows no longer does so. Questions aren't necessarily always between two question marks. Speaking can be a question. In fact, it's the constant questioning of the possibility of transmitting an internal experience. Therefore, those who speak do so because they don't know. Only those who know do not speak. Knowledge is not an intellectual understanding, it is rather a not asking, not verbalizing, that is, not reducing. The state of knowing is intangible, immaterial, unspoken, and, I dare say, unconscious. A person is what they do not verbalize, what they do not question, what they do not show for the sake of showing. Therefore, one should not invalidate as non-existent anything that cannot be heard, seen, understood, or felt, especially when it comes to the knowledge of another person. The other person is that which does not try to transmit, that which does not know it exists, that is silent, of feeling and analysis. It's when you begin to doubt that you attempt an intellectual analysis. It's when you stop feeling that you begin to question. It's only when you live intensely and authentically that questions, intellectual analysis, and logic are no longer necessary. When you doubt and question the value of things, it's because you've stopped feeling and are trying to make the sensation return. There's no point in trying. Feeling isn't the result of an act of will or a decision. It's another dimension that appears or doesn't appear, but freely, never under coercion or imposition. That's why it's not worth deceiving yourself by forcing sensations and feelings. Doing so has only one consequence: nullity. From not seeing, when someone invalidates you and makes you feel bad, it only shows that they don't see or listen to you. For them, you are simply a reflection of their own vision, a tentacle-like extension of their point of reference. The person who sees you this way doesn't know how to learn from you, perhaps because they don't know how to learn from themselves. The world, for her, exists only as a reflection of a redundant and closed model that has been created of it, or as an idea or preconception of how it should be. The world does exist, but it is one who learns from it. When one stops learning from the world, it means that it has been destroyed. On the conditions of learning, learning from a person is only possible when two conditions are met. A, that the person from whom one learns is authentic, that is to say, he does not want to teach. And B, that the learner does not introduce the other into a category, model, or value. Being authentic means being without question or analysis. In fact, only those who don't know they are authentic are authentic. Those who don't need to know because they are authentic. But that's not enough to learn. The learner must be humble, that is, not think they know what they're going to learn, much less how that learning should be. The reason for this is obvious. Learning is creating, and creation is essentially the emergence of something new, something that doesn't exist until the moment it appears. It's giving life to something that can't be predicted, since if it were possible to predict it, it would cease to be creation and become mere repetition. Of love. Love is neither jealousy nor need, nor possession, nor agreement, nor struggle. Love cannot be played with. It only appears when things align, when one is able to create and see, not with eyes of desire, but with a lack of need. It simply sees. When this happens, love loses its monogamous character. It becomes universal and open to all. There are no limitations or requirements to meet. Love is a meeting of states of being, an understanding without doubts or restrictions, without structures or agreements. Love is a creative act. It is the construction